Hello, my name is Timothy Lynch. I'm an Associate Professor in American Politics here at the University of Melbourne. I'm delighted to be able to welcome back for our concluding session on a remarkable election, Andrea Carson, a political scientist from La Trobe, and Andrea's most recent book is Investigative Journalism, Democracy and the Digital Age, and Tom Daly from the Melbourne School of Government, a democracy scholar and author of Alchemists, Questioning Our Faith in Courts as Democracy Builders. Was that close enough for you? In my several decades observing American elections, I don't think the sense of anticipation could have been greater, nor the result much tighter. We know in 2000 it came down to one state, but the narrow margins of victory in several states this year were really quite remarkable. Let me suggest that though it's mathematically possible for Trump to win, it's highly improbable. So electorally, I think he's lost, and his only recourse now is a legal route, which I think is strewn with minefields. Let me go to my brilliant guests and ask them where they think we're at the moment. Andrea, please.
Well, I think it's Biden's to lose, which is effectively what you've said in your introduction there. In some ways, everyone's holding their breath with this election, and yet it's not all that surprising, is it? On the first iteration or version that we had of this seminar series, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how polarized America is. And now we've seen that borne out with the election result, where there's not many Americans who sit in between. They're either with the red or with the blue team. And we've seen that in the very narrow result, lack of a result that we've got at the moment, standstill. We also see that, as you mentioned, Tim, that Trump will pull out all stops to stop the vote count and legally contest some of these results. He's got the result that he wants for the moment and doesn't want it to go any further. And is using some rather concerning and frightening language around voter integrity and the fraudulent election process. So as an audience watching from afar, a long way away in the Southern Hemisphere, everyone needs to be patient and to see how this plays out. It's not just getting the votes, it's who counts them and how they get counted, as a famous Russian leader once said.
Tom, what are your thoughts at this juncture?
Yeah, I think the fact that this is so close actually speaks to just how volatile these elections are themselves, when we think that we've been facing any number of scenarios, from a Trump win to, a slight win for Biden to a very clear win or even a landslide for Biden, were all on the table before we sort of came in. And I think that's been a huge problem for the Biden side, that a very clear win would have just made it much harder to for Trump to sort of claim that there was a clear fraud and claim that there is very little in it between them. I've been very concerned about the language that came out last night from Trump. Claiming that you've won elections before the counting has finished, that's tin pot dictator stuff. That's stuff that the US State Department has been railing against and trying to stop in other countries for decades. And then we see it in the US, and it's sad to see it. For me, I think that was one of the worst case scenarios that some people were concerned about, because this is going to be part of a pattern. It was unsurprising, of course, because he's been setting up the scene for this for months. But I think that itself is also a source of real concern, that this is just all part of a pattern. And this is somebody who will do anything at this point to claim the win.
At this point, it's hard to know what kind of behavior would be beneath Trump as he tries to secure some advantage. There are some silver linings here, aren't there? One would be that this is the most democratic election, certainly in terms of numbers. No two men across American history have commanded more votes than we have just seen, which does really create the obligation to make sure they're accurately counted. So democracy is not dying. Millions turned out in numbers unseen in American history to suggest there is a faith in American democracy. And that we know that race framed a significant part of the campaign, certainly during the Northern Summer. But Trump actually did pretty well when it came to securing non-white votes. Black men voting for Trump has gone from 8% 4 years ago, from 13% 4 years ago to 18%. And black women has doubled from 4% to 8%. Now, I'm not suggesting this makes him a great multicultural warrior, but perhaps part of his appeal to African Americans stuck with some of them. So, and Hispanics as well have voted for Trump in numbers that Democrats are going to find hard to explain. What do we think?
I think American democracy is more robust than some of the alarming language that we're hearing from Trump and his attempts to subvert the democratic norms that we're familiar with. And Americans were engaged with politics. It's a record turnout since 1900, looking like about 67.5% turnout, 195 million Americans. Most of that before Election Day, 100 million. And that's not a surprise because we knew that Democrat supporters in particular were more fearful about coming out on polling day because of the risk of coronavirus. And some of the work that we've done that we spoke about in the first session showed that Trump supporters don't feel that same level of risk about catching coronavirus or indeed the consequences of it because they're listening to very different media. But America does have robust democratic institutions. And even though some of them have been weakened in the 4 years of the Trump presidency, namely the media, which is what I specialize in, where we have seen the weaponization against mainstream media with language around fake news and lamestream media, the media is playing an important role right now of scrutinizing this result. It's a check and balance on some of the language that Trump's coming out with, as are the courts, and they will be tested. And this is something Tom knows more about than I do. But we're already seeing some of the contests being played out in the courts, and that will take some time. But the other check and balance is also academia. There's some very robust, strong academic institutions in the States that are also giving commentary around this at the moment. So I guess what I'm saying is that nothing's occurring behind closed walls. It's transparent, and that's an important part of democracy. On the second part of your question around the voters and Trump lifting the black vote in America, I think one thing we need to remember is what his skill set is. He's a very good orator. Whether you like Trump or you don't like Trump, and we need to remember that these groups are not homogenous groups, Trump is really good at cut through. He puts out some core messages and they get repeated back to him. And I heard that this week listening to Vox Pops with Trump supporters. He says repeatedly that he's a businessman, not a politician. He's a successful businessman, that he wants to make America great again, that he's anti-elite, and that he doesn't believe in fake news and fake polls. And the people that support him reiterate these messages when they are interviewed and in their language in support of Trump. So it's not surprising that we're seeing almost half the country look like they wanted to go out there and support Trump. They like what they hear from him, and that includes some of the black voters and the Hispanics especially, who are suspicious of socialism.
One of the silver linings we do have to look at is there were serious concerns about, voting simply not working and there being wide-scale voter intimidation, for example. That didn't happen yesterday, and we have to really recognize that. But for me, well-organized elections or elections that come off on the day don't suggest that democracy itself is working well. And I think what we have to actually recognize here, and this isn't a problem that has been created by Trump himself, but many of the voters who would have voted yesterday and in the sort of recent weeks and months, they have voted despite very serious voter suppression becoming a serious problem across the US. And we saw that in people queuing for hours just to vote, for example. We saw that in ballot drop-off boxes in Texas, for example, 1 per county and so on, you know. That has been a serious, serious problem. And I think, you know, that has to be taken along with extreme gerrymandering, for example, in many states. So for many people, their vote doesn't really count because of all the gerrymandering that has been happening for decades under both Democrats and Republicans, it must be said, but Republicans in recent decades have really accelerated this. The other point I just want to make as well is, well, 2 points. One is whether this shows a faith in democracy or that it was a fear-based election. And I just want to sort of point up the amount of fear-mongering that has been a central part of the Trump campaign in particular. Of course, there's fear on the other side. You know, Biden has been saying this is a battle for the soul of the nation. But on the Trump side, you know, he's depicted all the racial justice protesters as extremely violent, contrary to all the evidence. He's characterized what are pretty fairly middle of the road social democratic policies as Venezuela style, you know, authoritarian socialism. He's talked about the Green New Deal as leaving cities without any energy and shutting down all transport. And he's been retweeting endlessly conspiracy theories pumped out by QAnon. Now, I want to emphasize here that, you know, he has promoted QAnon-linked Twitter accounts more than 250 times. And the central conspiracy theory that QAnon espouses is that Biden and senior Democrats, along with the deep state, are leading a satanic pedophile ring. Now, when asked individually and specifically to disavow that claim, Trump has refused to do so, simply saying, I don't know about QAnon, right? That is a huge, huge worry because that amount of fear-mongering, it hasn't really, in many cases, been an election on the facts, on the real policies. It's been all about this fear. The final thing I want to say is, we're in a situation now where, and I was looking at the Gallup polls across 2020, and the percentage of people who say they have no partisan affiliation has been between 36% and 45% throughout this year. So we're talking now about a political system where each of the parties individually is dwarfed by the number of people who don't have a partisan affiliation. So even if we were able to achieve bipartisanship, that would only cover, you know, a certain proportion of the American population. So these are really serious issues. And I think it's not enough to say the elections passed off on the day. We have to take it in context, and the wider context is enormously troubling.
A number of questions about the possibility of electoral reform, the messiness of the electoral college. Tom, you mentioned gerrymandering, disenfranchisement. How do you go about changing this in a system which is so polarized? Andrea, do you want to take that on?
Well, these are not new issues. Gerrymandering has been going on for a long time with the changes to the boundaries of the districts, and they've been challenged in the courts. It's an entrenched cultural behaviour of the system. As similarly with the Electoral College, there's been challenges to that over time as well. None of them have been successful. Is it in need of reform? Yes, it appears so, but it's not an easy pathway to achieve that.
Tom?
Yeah, I think this is one of the real challenges for a viable electoral democracy to continue in the US. I think we can find sources of hope. There are already independent electoral boundary commissions in some states. It would be a question of trying to get some sense of uniformity, getting the best practice to become the uniform practice or a coherent practice across the US. Another possibility that some people have mentioned recently to me include things like involving citizens, having citizen participation in electoral districting and drawing boundaries. I'm not sure whether that could work in the hyper-polarized climate of the US, but it shows that there's a lot of thinking going into what these reforms might look like. I think beyond that, I think that the other absolutely vital plank of electoral reform that's needed is to address big money and dark money in politics. We're talking about an election where the financing for the spending rather on these elections, both presidential and congressional, have reached 14 billion, twice of what it was in 2016, and 6.6 of that went to the presidential campaigns themselves. Only 10 individuals have provided about 8% of that, about $760 million. So we're talking about, you know, an electorate where about 240 million people have the vote, but 10 people are able to provide that much of the financing. And that's been getting worse and worse and worse since 2000, and especially since the Citizens United judgment of the Supreme Court in 2010. And unless that is dealt with, you know, we're going to have only partial reform, and it's only going to get worse. We're going to end up with something that looks more like a plutocracy than a democracy.
Can I add to that, Tim? The other side of that equation around the super spending and the dark money, which is unfettered in the American context, is also the free media, the amount of information that's able to circulate because the media runs stories on it. And one of the strengths of Donald Trump has been to get that cut through, to be able to garner the headlines. And when it doesn't suit him, to circumvent mainstream media and go through social media with his outbursts on Twitter. And one of the perhaps silver linings here is a recognition by the social media companies such as Facebook and Twitter during this period that they can't abdicate their responsibility for what ends up on their platforms. Now, I'm not saying that they're a shining light in this space, but they are showing some baby steps of responsibility about content. And we saw this with Twitter going against its old policy where it wasn't going to be the arbiters on political content by earmarking some of Trump's responses as being false information or of being suspect content, and Facebook also following suit. And at the moment, in the last 24 hours, the US online sphere is awash with misinformation, and both Facebook and Twitter, as some of the largest, with the greatest participants on social media, are signalling that it is not true that Trump has won the election at this point, as he signaled in his speech in our time last night.
My concern, I think, with going after social media is that they are progressive hegemonies. And unless you're going to ask them to recruit conservative censors to balance off the progressives, I don't see how social media could be depolarized. But let me ask another, a different question, and that's why did we get it so wrong? I mean, I've been meeting here for 4 weeks, and I spent a good deal longer saying, well, I trust the polls. If people are betting money, I don't bet because I never win. But people text me saying, how should I bet? And my response has been, go with the polling. And the polling turned out to get it wrong. I think Hollywood got it wrong. I think the university campuses got it wrong. The coasts, the elites, whatever, however you want to describe this establishment, they all expected, because of COVID, because of the obvious inanities and idiosyncrasies of Donald Trump, that he would be wiped out, or certainly that Biden would cruise home. And they were all wrong. Why were we so wrong? Why was it so close?
Yeah, the polling was wrong, and this feeds into Trump's narrative that they're fake polls and just garners further support from his base. The polling companies had made a real effort to try and clean up the way they were doing their polls, changing some of their methods and weighting against education and rural versus metro. But as we can see, they were 8 percentage points out in many of the major swing states, which means that they're not useful to us. Why is that the case? I guess there's a number of reasons. In a setting with voluntary voting, it's one thing to poll people. You need to make sure that they're the same people that actually turn out to vote. Some people don't give honest answers when they're being polled and have been discouraged from giving honest answers by sections of the media. You also have shy Trumpers, those that support him but don't want to tell another human being that they're doing so, which can be misleading. And also, you touched on this earlier, Tim, where you've got a decentralised electoral system that's played out in every single state. So state polls are really important. Polling is also very expensive. So you need to have enough data points in every state to make accurate judgments about what the outcome is going to be in that state. So in some ways, one of the solutions might be more polling. But I also wonder whether it's because the nature of politics has changed. When you had the American Voter, a seminal book back in the 1960s, people largely then voted against certain lines, whether it was a familial line, the way that their parents voted, on socio-demographic lines. If they were working class, they would vote one way as opposed to if they had a college education. And I wonder whether a lot of those assumptions no longer work, which is what the polling companies base on when they weight them. That we now vote, or Americans might vote more on issues as they come up, on identity politics, on other things that aren't picked up in the assumptions that are built into the weighting of the polls.
I think pollsters will have an even greater job to recover their reputation after this one. Tom, can I reframe the question only slightly? If you look at the exit polling, I know this will take time to work itself out, but the levels of fervour and enthusiasm for Trump were remarkable. It's one of the great stories of his presidency, I think, that those that liked him adored him. So the numbers I've seen are 70% of those voting for Trump were voting for Trump because they adored him. Whereas for Biden, it was 70% were voting for Biden because he wasn't Trump. So I can't recall a political figure, it's certainly in my lifetime, that can inspire this much adoration and distrust. So I wonder, how far can you counter that unless you can find a democratic version of Donald Trump?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we can already see the recrimination starting to sort of roll out within the Democratic camp that Biden was simply an uninspiring candidate. He was the consensus candidate. He is yesterday's candidate is sort of, the discussion that's now being rolled out. Would Yang have done better? Would any number of other candidates have done better? But I think what this shows us is that the divisiveness that Trump brings can actually have electoral dividends. This is, now somebody put it very well yesterday, Trump is not seeking to be the president of the US. He's seeking to be the president of his US, the red voters who are his ardent base. And he was being criticized in recent weeks. Why are you speaking endlessly to your own base and firing them up? We need to reach out to other voters. And he seemed to just have this view of, it worked for me in 2016, it's going to work for me again, hopefully. And I think we do see that he has crafted a vision of what he offers a certain type of voter, and he sells that extremely effectively. I mean, he is an expert communicator, say anything you want about him, but he, as Andrea said, he's able to cut through. And I think, what he's managed to do on top of that is hit a number of sort of policy points for different demographics that we didn't expect him to get, like the Latino surge in Florida, for example. He has used, that talking about Venezuela style socialism, that really speaks to people who are all too aware of what's happened in Venezuela, who have suffered, or their parents might have suffered, or their grandparents might have suffered under the communist regime in Cuba and so on. Now, I think it's too much to say that Trump has a very fully articulated sort of mental map of what he's actually speaking to, but his bullet points of what he's actually talking about do resonate. And I think another point just to quickly make is, I think this was a test overall for polling companies, and they had promised that they were able to correct. And there was even talk about, were they overcorrecting this time to sort of learn the lessons from 2016, both the lessons from the last presidential election, but also the Brexit referendum. And I think I completely agree with Andrea. I think this is not a technical fix that you can fix this with changing how we do polling. It is a sign of a political landscape that has just changed utterly.
Yes, thank you. A question from the audience. What would you do if you were Trump at this point?
Well, I guess I'd be doing what Trump is doing if I thought like Trump, and that is protecting my legacy. The stakes are high for Trump. He has certain protections being in the White House against litigation. If he is removed from the White House, he is open to action against him. So I would be doing everything I could to preserve my role as president in the White House, and that would be to get the base firmly on board with pretty emotional language, to do the legal challenges, which we've already seen start up in 4 states, and to do the doubt about the sanctity of the election, which he's also doing, and make his supporters feel like an extension of him and feel the same level of anger. It's a kind of a macabre exercise for pretending to be Trump and talking in such Machiavellian terms. But I think that's the way he thinks. He thinks about power in absolute terms, which is why he does get likened to being a tin pot despot, because that's what they do. They alienate the media and they try and concentrate power as much as they can by casting doubt on any critics. And critics are often those in the media and academia.
Do you not think, Andrea, that he'd also be mindful that he's got to survive and be respected in this system? And part of that might entail gracious defeat.
No, I don't think that, Tim. I think he's a septuagenarian who's had a taste of 4 years in the White House and he wants to stay there. And he doesn't seem to be mindful about grace and dignity that we've seen in the last 4 years in public office. I don't see why that would be part of his legacy building. I think part of his legacy building would be more dynastic and staying there for 4 years and then building the way for one of his children to perhaps occupy the space when it is time for him to go.
Yeah, yes, I agree. I've struggled over the last 4 years to find some good in the man. And it's been a struggle because whenever you think this is your opportunity to actually be gracious or magnanimous or humble, he always defies that expectation. And all I can do is give him credit that until yesterday, it worked. He held together an administration, and admittedly in a very rickety way, but had a profound impact politically and culturally, and very nearly pulled it off a second time. So I don't have to like him, I think, to respect that he's got a model of behaviour that seems to have worked for him. Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, look, when I think about what's next, especially if we think about a second Trump term, I think one of the absolutely clear legacies that Trump leaves, and that would be to his advantage going into a second term, is especially having a 6-3 Conservative majority now on the Supreme Court, and what that might lead to. Amazingly, for some, there is talk that, you know, the Trump administration pulled some punches during the first term with an eye to being re-elected on things like immigration, not going too hard on dealing with and cutting down on immigration, for example. There is talk now that plans are being drawn up for a second term that we would see much bigger sort of action taken on cutting down immigration and dealing with immigrants and deporting immigrants, undocumented immigrants. I think more broadly, if we look, and I wrote about this not long ago, what we see worldwide when we see the type of leader and government that Trump represents, and by this I mean an authoritarian populist leader who believes that majority rule should be unconstrained, that's hostile to checks on executive power, that believes in democratic centralism, that all state organs must serve the government or even the leader, and not to have a system of checks and balances. when we see them dehumanizing political opponents or treating them as at least illegitimate enemies, when they're downplaying the importance of the individual and individual rights. And we've seen this already under the first term with criminal justice issues, abortion, free speech, and so on, and this employment of fear-mongering. What we've seen, whether it's in Poland or Hungary or Turkey or India, is a massive acceleration of that because of the freeing up of constraints because you've just been re-elected. And in each of those cases, the tactics have hardened from the government. The subtler sort of hollowing out of democratic constraints and rights has become much more overt, and they're mutually reinforcing. So what we get is, you know, pretty early on in a second term, you start to see a very altered political system. And it's sort of the cumulative effect of everything that's been done in the first term and then gets sort of ramped up in the second term. That's what I would be extremely worried about in a second Trump term, because he may not be the most disciplined individual, but he does have some thinkers and people around him who I think have a plan for what they would like to see, a centralization of power being at the very center of it. And they've achieved a lot that flies under the radar. I talked last week about, you know, the gutting of the State Department. We've also had the gutting of environmental agencies and other areas of the federal government. And I think we would see that absolutely a hallmark of a second term would be that shrinking of the state down to size. And that's been a long held sort of aim for even more centrist conservatives in the USA. So those would be my concerns.
No, you present those fears very clearly. And I suppose my reassurance to you would be, I see no way that he's going to have that second term. I do query though, and we're not going to have time to have a proper back and forth on this. I just query how far what you've outlined actually are outside of the political mainstream. I mean, he's commanded significant support because of these positions. So it's not that he's usurped power. He's actually been given through this. He has been facilitated by a mass of people, not by an establishment, by a mass of people, which is unusual. And I concede, if your concerns are broadly progressive and you believe in internationalism, these are concerning. But that might indicate how far these concerns have separated from the everyday concerns of men and women across the industrial Midwest, and bringing those back into some sort of synchronicity seems to me a central challenge of the Biden administration. How much of the Trump administration that we've just seen is going to be refracted, and how much will inform the Biden administration? Are we going to see a counter-revolution, or are we going to see a kind of Trump-light approach from Joe Biden? Andrea?
I think we're going to see, if Biden is successful, a period of consistency and repair, which is going to look very different to the erraticness of the Trump administration. And we've spent a lot of the time talking about Trump the man and how he's able to garner his base and activate people by picking up on their fears rather than their hopes. I think Biden's going to be more about trying to bring America back together, not defining individuals by being blue or red supporters, but by being united under the flag of the United States. But I also think we need to acknowledge just how complicit Republicans have been in Trump's behaviours. That it's not just Trump out on a whim here. He's been supported the whole way. He got the primaries back in 2016. In this lead-up period for the 2020 presidential election, we've seen active legal challenges right across the country by Republican governors and others trying to restrict the deadlines or to stop the counting, restrict the deadlines on the postal ballots, and now stop the counting. It's not just Trump acting alone in creating this environment that favours one side of politics over the other. But to your question, I think we'll see a really different administration if Biden gets through. I think we've seen that in the debates that these are men who are really different. And I think it'll be a steady as she goes approach under Biden if he is successful. If he's not and Trump gets in, I think he will be, it'll be uncharted territory. I think he'll feel enlivened, and his behaviours won't have the shackles that he's had with the first administration, because he knows he can go for broke in the second. But I don't, at this point, I think, as I said at the outset, I think it's Biden's election to lose.
I completely agree with Andrea as well. And the one thing I would want to sort of make very clear is, I think, you know, even if Trump leaves the scene and doesn't get a second term, which is the most likely outcome, Trumpism is only partly about Trump himself. Yeah. We have to emphasize that. So, you know, he is the symptom of and the result of background conditions that led to his win in 2016, and he's acted as an accelerant of those trends. He didn't create them, and those are the increasing economic equality that we've seen growing for decades, the growing precarity, hyperpolarized politics, a completed distorted media and information landscape, the broken party system that I talked about already, big money and dark money in politics, talked about that already, and demographic trends. You know, we're looking at a white majority that's projected to be a white minority by 2045. And that has produced this extremely strong reaction, especially on the conservative side. And Trump has, his whole 4 years have been an expression of and a sort of acceleration of the mainstreaming of white supremacy in US politics. So whoever is president, you know, from this point onwards and for the next 4 years, they're going to have to deal with all of those issues. And if they don't actually, if they're not equal to dealing with those issues, you know, we're just going to see the ongoing, you know, distortion of and dysfunction in US politics.
Oh, well, yes, I entirely get the notion that the Republicans have been facilitators. I think my question in response would be, doesn't he represent a singular failure of democratic politics? That it used to be Democrats that would speak for this industrial working class, for the rural men and women of the United States, and instead, and it's a caricature, but as a consequence carries a certain truth, the left now is dictated by racial questions, by identity questions, and they speak, to use your phrase, they denigrate whites as white supremacists, as kind of Neanderthal racists. And it's those men and women who were culturally predominant 50, 60 years ago who turned to Trump for some sort of cultural salvation. So isn't there a great democratic challenge now to prevent another Trump from coming? If the need for a Trump, as you've outlined, Tom, is so profound, what are the Democrats going to do to staunch that need, to quench it?
I think it's the central question for US politics for the coming years. I don't think the Democrats have really crafted a genuine answer to it. When we look at the campaign platform for these elections, I think they're still trying to tweak and nibble at the edges. The policy incrementalism of the Obama and Clinton eras is still sort of the order of the day. And I just don't think that's going to cut it into the future.
The Democrats themselves are very divided, and we see that with the left-wing branch of the party and the consensus candidate that's ended up with Biden, who through anyone's reckoning is a pretty an uninspiring candidate, a man in past his prime of life who is a white male, who's probably past his peak in politics. That's not an inspiring choice coming from the Democrats, and yet it's something that I think is almost demanded from the American polity, which is a fairly conservative public, that there wasn't the capacity to put a woman in the Oval Office, as was attempted in 2016, that there's a female running mate for Biden, but that's as close to power as what the Americans are prepared to get at this point. So I think it also speaks to something about the American public.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, and I did want to return to our poll question and get your responses to it.
Whoa.
Well, that's pretty decisive. Trumpism is not dead. Andrea, what's your response to that result?
I was a little shocked just how definitive it is, but I agree with it. I don't think Trumpism's dead. I think Tom outlined why it's not, that it's about more than just, well, it might have been you that said it, Tim. Trumpism's not just about Trump the man, it's about a certain type of politics that's playing out in America, and all those things of economic inequality that have allowed that to flourish over time, and the anger that's building up with the American people for those that look across to someone else and see something that they don't have. And those fracture lines are getting wider over time, not narrower. And Trump has just been the master who's been able to exploit that anger using very clear language and his proficiency using the television medium to be able to do it.
Yeah, I think the biggest question is, how do you learn the lessons from Trump and what he's been able to achieve and actually put them to good ends? I think that's really the central challenge. You know, there's a lot that can be learned in what he's achieved that could actually be put to good use. And that, for me, I think is the lesson that the Democrats need to walk away from these elections with.
Can I add something a little provocative here? And that is what sort of discussion we would be having right now if coronavirus wasn't a global pandemic.
It's my failing that we didn't get to COVID in sufficient time. But my quick response to that would be, given the way how close it was, COVID may well have made the difference, that Trump would have claimed credit for a booming economy, and it would be difficult to see how Biden would have displaced him. Do you share that?
Absolutely, I do, Tim. I mean, you can't prove the counterfactual, but I would have thought Trump playing to his strengths would have been the economy. He would have been able to shore up the narrative with all the erratic decision-making he has done over the last 4 years to say, I made America great again. And that was stripped from him. In fact, he couldn't even protect his own family from COVID or himself. So it exposed weakness rather than strength. And that really played to his disadvantage.
Couldn't agree more. Looks like we're all in agreement on that, at least.
Well, I don't like to end on a point of agreement, but I'm going to, because we're out of time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I know there are stalwarts out there that have attended every session. We're grateful for your taking the time to be part of our debates and discussions around a remarkable political cultural event in the US. I've been studying the US for all my adult life, and its messiness, its confusions, its absurdities, I find both compelling and repelling. It's an exercise in the people's capacity to establish their own government. All human life is there. So the idea that it should be linear and clean and with tidy processes is belied by its history, which is one of contention and debate and argument, because that's what the human condition is. So that's my attempt to end on a hopeful note. We've been joined by Roger Fairfax in a previous session. Roger was unable to make it this evening, but I want to thank him for being part of the sessions, to Tom and Andrea, and also to the team that makes this possible and makes all these academics punch well above their weight. Certainly true of me. Be brave out there and enjoy this close election as it unfolds. Thank you and goodbye.